In this video, I'm going to show how to do air sleeve maintenance on a Fox rear shock. This is a service that Fox recommends doing every 30 hours of riding. If you ride frequently, this could be every 3 to 6 weeks. I don't ride in very harsh conditions, so I actually do this about every 50 hours of riding. The service is easier than you might think. In fact, removing and installing the rear shock is the majority of the work. I will not be showing how to change the seals and backup rings in this video, but I will show you at what point in this process you would do so. There's only a few things that you'll need to do this service. You'll need a 4, 5, or 6 millimeter Allen wrench depending on the bolt configuration holding the shock on your bike. You'll need 1 or 2 grip pads like this. You'll need Fox float fluid. You can also get this in a 5cc pillow pack, they call it. And you need just a cheap syringe that you can find at a drugstore. And finally, you'll need preferably a vise, and preferably one that has soft jaws. Because I don't have a soft jawed vise, I have a steel jawed vise. I use an extra grip pad to protect the shock. The first thing that you want to do, if you don't remember how much air pressure you have in your shock, is just hook up a shock pump and write down the pressure. The next thing you want to do is let the air out of the shock. Then push down the saddle, cycle the shock a few times, and let any remaining air pressure out. You'll need to remove the rear wheel from the bike. That way when you undo the shock bolts, the swing arm won't drop down too hard and too fast. On this particular bike, it's a lot easier to access the lower shock bolts by removing the cranks, which I've done so. So you may need to do that. Now I'm going to remove the top shock bolt, and be real careful because you're going to have spacers on the top and the bottom, and you want to make sure they don't fall to the ground, and you also want to pay attention to how they're placed in there. On this particular bike, I need to use a 6 millimeter Allen wrench on the left and a 5 on the right, and I'm going to remove the lower shock bolt. Again, pay attention to any spacers or washers that you have inside. As you remove the second shock bolt, make sure you grasp the shock so it doesn't fall to the ground. Now on this bike, I can actually leave the left shock bolt, the shaft, partly in the bike. This bike uses these washers. This is a giant ring on each side of the shock. At this point, you're going to clamp the shock in your vise. Now again, because I don't have a soft jawed vise, I'm going to use this grip pad to pad the shock. Make sure you mount the top part of the shock. You do not need to do your vise too tight. Now you're going to remove the travel adjust O-ring. Place a rag in the bottom eyelet of the shock. This will ensure that the shock body does not fly off when you unscrew it. Now that I have this in, I'm just going to press the valve a little bit, make sure all the air is out. I'm going to take my other grip pad, grasp the body of the shock, and turn it counterclockwise, and I'm going to unscrew the body. Now that I have the body unscrewed, I'm going to remove the rag, and I'm going to pull the body off the shock. You'll hear a popping sound when you do this. Now, I'm going to take a paper towel or a clean rag, put something like parts cleaner or isopropyl alcohol, and just wipe down the inside of the shock body, as well as the outside. Also make sure that you clean the seals inside and the wiper seal on the outside. Now I said that I'm not going to change the wiper seal or the seals inside or the backup rings inside. But make sure you inspect those and make sure they don't have any tears in them. This is the point that you would change the seals and backup rings of the shock body if you needed to do so. And that's something that you probably need to do about once a year. And you can pick up a rebuild kit for these at your local bike shop. With the shock still clamped in the vise, I'm going to do the same thing. Take rubbing alcohol or parts cleaner on a rag or paper towel, wipe down the shaft, the eyelet, and also the seals and backup rings. Make sure you also inspect these seals and make sure there's no tears in them. It's at this point that you would change the seals and backup rings if you had a rebuild kit. Now I'm going to take my syringe, dip it in the float fluid, and get some in there, and put a decent amount of float fluid on the seal. Again, you can also buy what Fox calls a pillow pack, which is a 5cc pack of float fluid, instead of having a whole bottle in a syringe. I'm going to also take the shock body. I'm going to use my syringe and put a liberal amount of float fluid on the seal inside. At this point, I'm going to slide the shock body onto the shaft. Do not try to screw the shock body into the upper part of the shock yet. We're going to do that when it's on the bike, and it makes it a lot easier. Also, make sure you install your travel adjust O-ring on the shaft at this time. The shaft may have turned when you unscrewed the shock body. Just make sure it's lined up. I'm going to put the shock back on the bike. On this particular bike, it's easier to start with the lower shock mount in reverse of how I took it off. Make sure you put your spacers back in as they were when you took it off. Notice that I still have the shock body unscrewed from the top. We're going to wait until we install the rear tire and put the bike on the ground and compress the suspension, and that'll make it a lot easier to screw the shock body back into the top. Now I'm going to install the top bolt. And just as a side note, since you pulled the shock off and you have the bearings kind of exposed, it's probably a good idea to take some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel or rag and also wipe down the outside of the bearings and anywhere that you can't get to in a normal cleaning procedure. Okay, I've got the bike out of the work stand and on the ground. And I've also, of course, got the rear wheel installed. I'm going to take about 2 to 3 cc's or 2 to 3 milliliters of float fluid. And before I screw the shock body on, I'm going to pour this in the top. Now, take your grip pad, compress the suspension, and once the shock body makes contact with the top, just screw it back on. You only need to do this hand tight. Do not use a strap wrench to get this tight. Grip it hard with your pad and put it hand tight. Now I'm just going to take my shock pump and add the appropriate pressure. So that's pretty much all there is to doing the routine air sleeve maintenance on a Fox shock. Just a couple notes. One is you saw how easy it was for me to get this shock on and off the bike and to do the service. That's because this is a pretty standard Fox shock. If you have a proprietary type shock, it may be harder to get it on and off the bike and do the actual service. That's one thing you may want to pay attention to when shopping for a bike. Also, know the torque specs for your bike, particularly the shock bolts. You may want to look them up online before doing this service or check with your local shop. Thanks for watching.